Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, here to keep you company as the day comes to a close. Before our story begins, I wonder, is there one small thing you like to do before sleep? Perhaps dimming the lights, settling into a favourite chair, or simply listening quietly. You may share it with us if you wish. Subscribe if these moments bring you comfort. Now breathe slowly and allow the story to carry you gently onward. Chapter 1. A Season of Well-Remembered Customs. There are towns in England, and Harthwell was decidedly one of them, where Christmas arrives not with the sudden brilliance of an unexpected gift, but with the comfortable predictability of an old friend who knows precisely when he is expected, and would not dream of appearing a moment too soon or too late. It was a town that took considerable satisfaction in the regularity of its seasons, the orderliness of its streets, and the unvarying nature of its annual celebrations. The High Street, on the morning of which I write, presented that particular appearance of festive preparation which might have been observed on any December morning for the past 50 years. The greengrocer had arranged his wares with the same mathematical precision that his father had employed before him. The baker's window displayed mince pies arranged in pyramids of such exactitude that one might have supposed them to have been positioned by a master of geometry, rather than by the flowery hands of Mr. Wickham, who had been arranging them thus since before the present queen had taken her throne. Even the snow, had it been so inconsiderate as to fall, would surely have known to settle in the approved manner, dusting the eaves and window ledges with that precise coating which tradition demanded, and which anything more or less would have been regarded as a decided impropriety. It was in this town on this particular December morning that we must make the acquaintance of Mr. Samuel Trewin, a gentleman whose profession was as modest as his demeanour. He served as assistant to the town registrar, a position which required both precision and discretion, qualities which he possessed in such abundance that one might have suspected nature of having designed him specifically for the role. He was a man of middle years and middle height, with that particular sort of face which provokes neither admiration nor dislike, but which settles into the memory with the comfortable familiarity of a well-worn book whose pages one has turned many times without ever quite recalling the exact particulars of the story. On this morning Mr. Trewin walked to his place of employment with the same measured step he employed every morning, his coat buttoned against the December chill, his hat positioned at an angle that suggested neither frivolity nor excessive sobriety. He nodded to Mrs. Pemberton, who was sweeping her doorstep with that vigorous determination which characterised all her domestic endeavours. He raised his hat to the Reverend Calder, who was examining the church notice board with the thoughtful expression of a man contemplating matters of considerable spiritual significance, though it must be said that the notice board contained nothing more momentous than the times of the Christmas services and a reminder about the parish hall gathering. The registry office, a building of modest proportions constructed of the same grey stone that characterised much of Harthwell's architecture, stood in that quiet corner of the High Street where respectability met necessity. Here were recorded the births, marriages, and deaths of the town's inhabitants, each event noted with that careful attention to detail which Mr. Trewin considered not merely as professional duty, but his moral obligation. The ledgers, arranged on their shelves with military precision, represented nothing less than the complete history of Harthwell's families, a chronicle written not in flowing prose but in careful entries of dates and names. It was Mr. Trewin's custom, upon arriving at the office each morning, to spend a few moments ensuring that everything was in its proper place before commencing the day's work. This morning was no exception. He hung his coat on the third peg from the door, a habit established so long ago that he could not have said with certainty when it had begun. He adjusted his spectacles, another gesture so automatic that he performed it without conscious thought. And then, as he did every morning, he opened the ledger that contained the day's appointments and obligations. But I must interrupt this peaceful scene to introduce another personage whose presence in our narrative is essential to the proper understanding of events. Mrs. Eleanor Finchley was a lady of considerable standing in Harthwell, a position she had achieved not through any accident of birth, but through that particular combination of charitable works and social determination which, in a town of Harthwell's character, commanded both respect and a certain degree of cautious deference. She organised the Christmas baskets for the deserving poor, a task she approached with the systematic thoroughness of a general planning a military campaign. She sat on every committee that required sitting upon, and chaired most of them with that firm but gracious authority which discouraged opposition while maintaining the appearance of democratic consultation. Mrs. Finchley's house, a substantial residence on Church Street, was decorated for Christmas with that careful attention to propriety which characterised all her undertakings. The wreath on the door was neither too large nor too small, the candles in the windows neither too bright nor too dim. Everything was precisely as it should be, as it had been the year before, and as it would undoubtedly be the year following. She took considerable satisfaction in this regularity, viewing it as evidence of moral steadiness in an increasingly uncertain world. The third member of our small company of principal characters requires introduction, though he would himself be the first to protest against being considered principal in anything. Reverend James Calder had served as vicar of St. Michael's Church for the better part of 2 decades, a tenure marked by sermons of impeccable orthodoxy and a pastoral approach that emphasised comfort over challenge. He was universally liked, a circumstance which gave him considerable pleasure, for he was a man who valued harmony above all other virtues and who would go to quite extraordinary lengths to avoid anything that might disturb the peaceful relations that he believed to be the foundation of Christian community. The Reverend was particularly fond of Christmas, viewing it as the one season when the natural human tendency toward goodwill was reinforced by the theological obligation. His Christmas sermons were anticipated with pleasure by his congregation, not for any particular profundity of theological insight, but for their reassuring familiarity. One might have attended the Christmas service any year in the past 15 and heard substantially the same sermon, a circumstance which the congregation viewed not as a failure of imagination, but as evidence of the eternal and unchanging nature of divine truth. It was in this setting, among these worthy individuals, that the events of our story must unfold. Harthwell prided itself on many things, but perhaps on nothing so much as its reliability. Here was a town that remembered its obligations, that honoured its traditions, that kept its promises, or so it believed. For there are promises and promises, reader, and Harthwell, for all its pride in remembrance, had developed a most particular talent for remembering some things while allowing others to slip quietly into that convenient obscurity where inconvenient truths often take up residence. The town remembered its Christmas customs with admirable precision. It remembered the proper arrangement of greenery in the church, the approved recipes for seasonal puddings, the exact time at which the Christmas Eve service should commence. But there was another promise, made years before, which rested in the town's memory with rather less clarity, obscured not by the passage of time so much as by the gentle but persistent preference for forgetting what was uncomfortable to recall. As Mr. Trewin sat at his desk that December morning, as Mrs. Finchley consulted her list of charitable obligations, as the Reverend Calder composed yet another variation on his eternal Christmas theme, none of them could have suspected that this particular season would prove different from those that had preceded it. The customs would be observed, the traditions maintained, the familiar rituals performed with their accustomed precision. But beneath this comfortable surface, something long buried was beginning to stir, like a seed that has lain dormant through many winters, and now, for reasons it cannot itself explain, chooses this particular season to send forth its first tentative shoot toward the light. The Christmas season in Harthwell had begun, as it always began, with assurance and familiarity, but this year, though none yet knew it, would end rather differently than it had begun. For promises, once made, have a peculiar persistence. They may be forgotten, obscured, or politely ignored, but they do not, for all that, cease to exist. They wait with that patient endurance which is characteristic of obligations unfulfilled, for the moment when they might at last be remembered and, perhaps, if conscience permits, finally kept. Chapter 2. The Promise. Spoken, then avoided. The parish hall of St. Michael's Church was not a building of architectural distinction, nor did it aspire to be. It had been erected some 30 years previous by subscription among the worthier members of the congregation, and it bore all the hallmarks of that particular species of ecclesiastical construction which values utility over ornamentation and durability over beauty. Its walls were of honest brick, its roof of sensible slate, and its windows of that clear glass which admits light without the unnecessary expense of coloured panes. It was, in short, precisely the sort of building that Harthwell admired, being neither ostentatious nor shabby, but occupying that comfortable middle ground where respectability resides. On the evening of Christmas Eve, this hall presented a scene of modest festivity. Garlands of holly and ivy, gathered from the hedgerows by willing hands and arranged with more enthusiasm than artistry, adorned the walls. Candles, placed at intervals upon the long table that occupied the centre of the room, cast a gentle light that softened the hall's utilitarian features and lent to the gathering an air of warmth that the architecture alone could never have achieved. The fire in the substantial hearth crackled with that particular sound, which seems designed by Providence specifically to promote goodwill and peaceful contemplation. Some 30 souls had assembled for what had become, over the course of many years, an established tradition. It was not precisely a party, for that would have suggested a degree of frivolity that Harthwell considered inappropriate to the solemn joy of Christmas Eve. Nor was it a formal gathering, for that would have implied a stuffiness incompatible with Christian fellowship. It existed, rather, in that pleasant ambiguity which allowed each person to bring to it precisely the degree of festivity or reverence that suited their individual temperament. Mrs. Finchley, it need hardly be said, had taken a leading role in the organisation of the event. She moved through the hall with that gracious authority which was her particular gift, ensuring that the refreshments were properly distributed, that no person stood alone in uncomfortable isolation, and that the conversation maintained that level of pleasant generality which avoids both excessive intimacy and awkward silence. She had dressed for the occasion with her customary attention to appropriate dignity, her gown of deep burgundy silk being neither so fine as to suggest vanity, nor so plain as to imply a lack of respect for the gathering. The Reverend Calder stood near the hearth, a cup of mulled wine in his hand, surrounded by a small group of parishioners who listened with that particular expression of polite attention which congregations reserve for their clergy when encountered in social rather than ecclesiastical settings. He was speaking, as he often did on such occasions, of the meaning of Christmas, though in terms so general and so thoroughly unobjectionable that one might have heard substantially the same sentiments from any number of vicars in any number of parishes throughout England. Mr. Trewin had positioned himself, as was his habit at such gatherings, at a slight remove from the centre of activity. He stood near one of the long windows, holding a cup of tea which had gone cold some minutes earlier, though he continued to hold it with the mechanical persistence of a man who finds in such objects a useful occupation for hands that might otherwise hang awkwardly at his sides. He observed the scene with that quiet attentiveness which was characteristic of him, noting without apparent judgment the various small dramas of social interaction that unfolded around him. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the energetic sweeper of doorsteps whom we have already encountered, who first directed the conversation toward matters that would prove in the event to be of considerable significance to our narrative. She had been speaking with increasing animation about the charitable works of the parish, a topic upon which she held strong and frequently expressed opinions, when she turned to the Reverend with that particular expression which precedes questions of a potentially awkward nature. "I was thinking, Reverend," she said, her voice carrying rather more clearly than she perhaps intended across the surrounding conversations, "about the various good works we undertake each year. The Christmas baskets are most admirable, of course, and the relief fund for the deserving poor is a credit to us all. But I found myself wondering whether there were not other obligations that the parish had undertaken in years past, old promises, as it were, that might benefit from renewed attention." The Reverend's expression, which had been one of benign contentment, underwent a subtle but unmistakable alteration. It was not precisely that he frowned, for that would have been incompatible with his character and his position. Rather, his smile maintained its general configuration while somehow conveying an entirely different sentiment, much as a house might remain structurally unchanged while its inhabitants depart and the rooms grow cold. "My dear Mrs. Pemberton," he said, with that gentle firmness which he employed when redirecting conversations that threatened to take inconvenient turns, "we must be careful not to burden ourselves with every passing fancy. The parish does excellent work that is both practical and achievable. We must husband our resources wisely." But Mrs. Pemberton, whose persistence was among her more notable qualities, was not so easily deflected. "Oh, I meant nothing fanciful, Reverend. I was thinking of actual commitments, things that were agreed upon and perhaps, in the press of daily affairs, set aside temporarily." It was at this moment that the Reverend made his error, and he simply continued in the vein of general reassurance. Had he deflected the inquiry with another pleasantry, the matter might have dissolved, as such matters often do in the gentle erosion of polite conversation. Instead, whether from a momentary lapse in judgment or from some deeper stirring of conscience, he spoke with a specificity that immediately drew the attention of those nearby. "You are perhaps thinking," he said, his voice lower now but still audible to a widening circle of listeners, "of that old business from some years ago, the promise made for the good of the town. But these things, dear lady, are more complicated than they appear. Circumstances change, and what seems clear in one season may prove quite impractical in another. We must not be hasty in resurrecting matters that were, after much careful thought, deemed best left to rest." The effect of these words upon the gathering was remarkable in its very subtlety. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic cessation of conversation. The various discussions that had been proceeding around the room continued much as before, and yet something had shifted, as though a draught had entered through a door left momentarily ajar, bringing with it a chill that was felt rather than seen. Mrs. Finchley, whose social instincts were highly developed, moved with admirable swiftness to restore the threatened equilibrium. "How very philosophical you are this evening, Reverend," she said with a smile that managed to be both warm and firmly conclusive. "But we must not burden our guests with abstractions on Christmas Eve. Mr. Larkin, I believe you have not yet tried the spiced cake. Do let me remedy that neglect." She guided the conversation with practised skill towards safer channels, and the gathering gradually resumed its former character. The candles burned steadily, the fire crackled, voices rose and fell in the comfortable rhythms of social exchange. To a casual observer, the moment would have appeared to pass without consequence, leaving no more trace than a pebble dropped into still water leaves once the ripples have subsided. But Mr. Trewin, standing by his window with his cold tea, had observed the entire exchange with that particular quality of attention which distinguishes true observation from mere seeing. He noted the Reverend's discomfort, Mrs. Finchley's swift intervention, and the careful manner in which those who had overheard the exchange now avoided returning to the topic, much as travellers might avoid a section of road known to be in poor repair. As the evening progressed toward its conclusion, as guests began to make their farewells and don their coats against the December cold, Mr. Trewin made himself useful in the quiet ways that were natural to him. He straightened chairs that had been pushed askew, collected abandoned cups and glasses, and extinguished candles with methodical care. His expression, for those few who might have studied it closely, revealed nothing of his thoughts. It was the same expression he wore when recording births and deaths in his ledgers, a look of calm attention that neither invited inquiry nor discouraged it, but simply existed as the natural accompaniment to his work. The Reverend, departing among the last of the guests, paused to thank Mr. Trewin for his assistance. "You are always so helpful, Samuel," he said, using the Christian name with that casual warmth which suggested intimacy without quite achieving it. "The parish is fortunate to have such willing hands." "It is no trouble, Reverend," Mr. Trewin replied, his voice carrying no particular inflection. "I am glad to be of service." They stood for a moment in the dimming hall, the last candle casting long shadows across the floor. Between them hung something unspoken, a question that neither asked and neither answered. Then the Reverend donned his hat, wished Mr. Trewin a blessed Christmas, and stepped out into the cold night. Alone in the parish hall, Mr. Trewin extinguished the final candle. The room fell into darkness, illuminated only by the fading glow of the fire. He stood quite still, a silhouette against the dying light, and if thoughts stirred behind his unremarkable features, they remained, like so much else in Harthwell, carefully contained beneath a surface of perfect propriety. The promise had been mentioned, however briefly, however obliquely. Like a door left slightly open, it admitted a draught that no amount of determined cheerfulness could entirely exclude. And though the evening had ended with all the proper expressions of seasonal goodwill, though everyone had departed to their homes with smiles and well wishes, something had been disturbed in the comfortable stillness of Harthwell's conscience. Whether it would settle back into its former repose, or whether it would continue to trouble the town's peaceful certainties, remained to be discovered. Chapter 3. Observations made without comment. The days that followed Christmas possessed that particular quality of suspended animation which characterises the period between one significant date and another. The shops of Harthwell remained closed for the most part, their proprietors having determined that the interval between Christmas and the New Year was better spent in domestic contentment than commercial endeavour. The streets, so recently animated by the purposeful bustle of seasonal preparation, now lay quiet beneath skies of that uniform grey which English winters provide with such reliable abundance. Mr. Trewin, whose duties at the registry office were considerably diminished during this tranquil interval, found himself with that rarest of commodities in a working man's life, which is to say, unstructured time. Another man might have employed these hours in festive recreation, or in those social visits which the season traditionally encouraged. Mr. Trewin, however, was a Trewin, creature of such settled habits that leisure discomforted him rather more than labour. He therefore took to walking, not with any particular destination in mind, but rather with that gentle aimlessness which sometimes reveals more than purposeful inquiry. It was during these perambulations that he began to notice certain small alterations in the customary patterns of Harthwell's social fabric. They were not dramatic changes, nothing so obvious as to draw immediate attention. Rather, they were of that subtle variety which only becomes apparent to one who possesses both leisure for observation and that particular cast of mind which notices when familiar rhythms falter. He observed, for instance, that Mrs. Hadley, the postmaster's wife, who had for years greeted him with cheerful volubility whenever their paths crossed, now offered only the briefest of acknowledgments before discovering urgent business elsewhere. He noted that Mr. Bryce, whose ironmongery occupied a prominent position on the high street, seemed to find considerable interest in the arrangement of his shop window whenever Mr. Trewin happened to pass, though the display had remained substantially unchanged for the better part of a month. Most striking, perhaps, was the behaviour of those older residents who had lived in Harthwell long enough to remember events that younger inhabitants knew only as vague family stories. These venerable members of the community, who in ordinary times were often pleased to share reminiscences with anyone patient enough to listen, now grew curiously reticent when Mr. Trewin appeared. Conversations which had been proceeding with animation would gentle themselves into safer channels, or discover natural conclusions with unexpected swiftness. These observations might have troubled a more suspicious nature. Mr. Trewin, however, possessed that rare quality of being able to notice things without immediately demanding explanations for them. He simply filed these small irregularities into that capacious mental ledger where he stored all those fragments of information which might, at some future time, resolve themselves into meaningful patterns. On the afternoon of the 28th of December, Mr. Trewin found himself walking past the offices of Harthwell's solicitor, Mr. Horace Blackwood, a gentleman whose practice had served the town's legal needs for longer than most could remember. The office, situated above a draper's shop, was accessible by a narrow staircase whose steps had been worn smooth by generations of clients ascending to settle wills, execute deeds, and navigate those various legal necessities which attend upon civilized life. As Mr. Trewin passed beneath the window of this establishment, He chanced to glance upward, and in that glance observed something which, while not remarkable in itself, added another small piece to the puzzle that was beginning, without his conscious intention, to form in his mind. Mrs. Finchley was descending the stairs, accompanied by Mr. Blackwood himself, who was speaking to her with that particular combination of deference and confidence which solicitors reserve for their most substantial clients. There was nothing inherently noteworthy in this encounter. Mrs. Finchley, as a woman of property and charitable responsibilities, would naturally have occasion to consult with a solicitor. And yet, as Mr. Trewin observed her expression, he detected something that gave him pause. She wore that look of careful composure which people adopt when they have just concluded business of a delicate nature, business that has left them neither entirely satisfied nor entirely troubled, but rather suspended in that ambiguous state between the two. Their eyes met as she reached the street, and for the briefest of moments something flickered in her expression. Not guilt, precisely, nor discomfort, but rather that particular quality of awareness which comes when one realizes one has been observed at the moment when one had believed oneself unobserved. She recovered immediately, offering Mr. Trewin a smile of practised warmth. "Mr. Trewin, what a pleasant surprise. I trust you are enjoying these quiet days?" "Indeed, Mrs. Finchley, the peace is most agreeable. You have been walking a great deal, I notice. I've seen you about the town on several occasions." It was said lightly as mere observation, yet Mr. Trewin detected in it that subtle note which suggested that his movements had been noted with rather more attention than casual encounters would ordinarily warrant. "I find the exercise beneficial," he replied, with equal lightness, "and the town reveals new aspects when one takes the time to observe it properly." Mrs. Finchley's smile remained fixed, though something in her eyes suggested that his words had been understood in their fuller implication. "Indeed it does. We are fortunate to live in a place of such constancy, though of course," she added, as though the thought had just occurred to her, "constancy requires vigilance. Things must be properly maintained, properly managed, if they are to remain as they should be." "I quite agree," said Trewin, though whether he was agreeing with her stated sentiment, or with some deeper meaning he perceived beneath it, he did not elaborate. They parted with mutual expressions of goodwill, and Mr. Trewin continued his walk. But the encounter had added yet another thread to the fabric of impressions he was accumulating. Mrs. Finchley's visit to the solicitor, her careful observation of his activities, the particular emphasis she had placed on the virtues of maintaining things as they were, all of these suggested a concern for stability that went beyond mere preference for the familiar. As evening drew on and Mr. Trewin made his way homeward through streets grown dim with winter twilight, he found his thoughts returning to the brief exchange at the Christmas Eve gathering. The Reverend's mention of an old promise made for the good of the town and subsequently deemed impractical had clearly disturbed something in Hartwell's carefully maintained equilibrium. That evening, seated in his modest lodgings, with a volume of history open before him but largely unread, Mr. Trewin permitted himself to consider what he had observed, not in any spirit of accusation, nor with any intention of forcing revelations from those who preferred to keep their counsel. He simply allowed the facts to arrange themselves in his mind, much as he might allow documents to organize themselves in the ledgers at his office. A promise had been made years ago for the benefit of the town. This promise had subsequently been set aside, deemed impractical or unnecessary. The mere mention of it had caused discomfort among those who would have been party to its making. And now, in the days following that mention, there was a subtle but unmistakable current of unease flowing through the town's social interactions, particularly among those old enough to remember the circumstances surrounding that promise. Mr. Trewin closed his book and gazed into the small fire that warmed his sitting room. He asked himself no questions, drew no conclusions, made no judgments. He simply noted what he had observed and waited with that patient stillness which was as natural to him as breathing. For Mr. Trewin understood, perhaps better than most, that some truths reveal themselves not through aggressive inquiry, but through patient attention. One need not dig to unearth what time and conscience will, in their own season, bring to the surface. One need only observe and wait, and trust that what has been buried in haste will eventually make its presence known to those willing to notice its stirring. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Outside, the December night settled over Hearthwell with that profound darkness which comes when clouds obscure both moon and stars. And in his quiet room Mr. Trewin sat in contemplative silence, neither seeking answers nor avoiding them, but simply being present to whatever truth might choose in its own time to make itself known. Chapter 4: Questions that Asked for Nothing. The registry office reopened on the 2nd day of January, and Mr. Trewin returned to his duties with that quiet satisfaction which comes from resuming familiar labours after a period of enforced idleness. The ledgers awaited him with their customary patience, the inkwell had been refilled by some thoughtful hand, and the stove, though cold when he arrived, soon warmed the room to that moderate temperature which he found most conducive to clear thought and careful penmanship. The first weeks of a new year traditionally brought certain predictable tasks. There were the registration of births that had occurred during the holiday period, deaths that had claimed the elderly or infirm during winter's harshest days, and occasionally marriages contracted by those young couples who, having become engaged at Christmas, saw no reason to delay the formalization of their happiness. Mr. Trewin attended to each of these matters with the same methodical care he brought to all his work, his pen forming letters of admirable regularity as he recorded life's essential transitions in the town's official chronicles. It was during this resumption of ordinary routine that opportunities presented themselves for those gentle inquiries which characterized Mr. Trewin's approach to understanding. He was not a man given to direct questioning, recognizing as he did that such methods often produced defensiveness rather than illumination. Instead, he possessed that valuable gift of being able to listen in such a way that people, quite without realizing it, revealed far more than any interrogation might have extracted. Mrs. Finchley called at the registry office on the morning of the 4th of January, ostensibly to inquire about the proper procedure for registering a charitable trust. She arrived with that air of brisk efficiency which she brought to all her undertakings, her questions precise and her demeanour entirely businesslike, yet, as Mr. Trewin explained the relevant procedures, consulting the appropriate volumes and producing the necessary forms, he observed that her attention wandered with uncharacteristic frequency. These charitable arrangements, she said as though the thought had just occurred to her, they require rather a lot of documentation, do they not? Records of funds received, accounting of their distribution, all manner of bureaucratic necessities. Indeed, Mrs. Finchley, the law requires considerable transparency in such matters. It is intended to protect both the donors and the intended beneficiaries. Quite right, of course, though I imagine that older charitable commitments, made perhaps before the current regulations were established, might not have been documented with the same thoroughness. Mr. Trewin looked up from the papers he had been arranging, his expression one of mild inquiry. That is certainly possible, though even informal arrangements, if they involve substantial sums or clear commitments, would typically have left some trace, a solicitor's memorandum perhaps, or entries in parish records. Mrs. Finchley absorbed this information with a small nod, her fingers adjusting the clasp of her reticule with unnecessary attention. Of course, circumstances do change. What seems sensible in one year may prove quite impractical in the next. Surely the law recognizes that flexibility must sometimes supersede rigid adherence to old agreements. The law is often more accommodating than one might suppose, Mr. Trewin replied, his tone carrying no particular emphasis, though it does tend to distinguish between genuine impossibility and mere inconvenience. A commitment that has become truly impossible to fulfill is one thing. One that has simply become awkward is quite another matter. There was a brief silence, during which Mrs. Finchley appeared to study the forms before her with unusual intensity. When she spoke again, her voice had acquired that particular quality which people employ when shifting from official business to more personal terrain. "You have always been so very helpful, Mr. Trewin, and so discreet. These are admirable qualities in one who handles matters of public record. I imagine people confide in you a great deal, knowing that their confidences will be properly respected." "I keep the confidences entrusted to me," Mr. Trewin said simply, "though I confess that most of what I hear consists of the ordinary details of ordinary lives. Births, deaths, marriages, the usual fabric of human existence." "Nothing extraordinary, then? No old mysteries lurking in those ledgers of yours?" It was said lightly, almost jestingly, yet Mr. Trewin detected beneath the levity a genuine inquiry. He considered his response with his customary care. "The ledgers record facts, Mrs. Finchley. Names, dates, legal relationships. If there are mysteries in Harthwell, I suspect they reside not in what has been written down, but in what has been omitted from the record. In the spaces between the documented events." Mrs. Finchley gathered her things with sudden decisiveness. "Well, I shall not take up any more of your valuable time. You have been most helpful as always." She paused at the door as though struck by an afterthought. "I do hope, Mr. Trewin, that you will not hesitate to call upon me should you ever find yourself in need of counsel or assistance. We have known each other many years, after all." After her departure, Mr. Trewin sat for some moments in contemplative stillness. The offer of assistance, coming as it did at the end of a conversation that had circled repeatedly around questions of old commitments and documentary evidence, suggested concern rather than mere neighbourly goodwill. Mrs. Finchley was worried about something, and her worry appeared to centre on what might or might not exist in official records. That afternoon brought another visitor in the person of Reverend Calder. The clergyman arrived without specific business, claiming merely to be taking a constitutional walk and finding himself in the vicinity of the registry office. He accepted Mr. Trewin's offer of tea and settled himself in the visitor's chair with that comfortable familiarity which comes from long acquaintance. Their conversation ranged over various topics of no particular consequence. The Reverend spoke of his hopes for the parish in the new year, mentioned several families who might benefit from charitable attention, and expressed satisfaction with the Christmas services. Throughout this pleasant but unremarkable discourse, Mr. Trewin listened with his customary attentiveness, noting not only what was said, but also what topics were carefully avoided. It was only as the Reverend prepared to depart that he broached with studied casualness a matter of more immediate relevance to our narrative. "I have been thinking," he said, adjusting his coat with unnecessary attention, "about that unfortunate moment at the Christmas Eve gathering. Mrs. Pemberton's questions, you know. They were well-intentioned, I am certain, but rather awkwardly timed. One does not wish to burden a festive occasion with matters that are both complicated and, frankly, best left undisturbed." "Mrs. Pemberton meant no harm, I'm sure," Mr. Trewin replied neutrally. No, of course not. She is a worthy soul, if perhaps overly enthusiastic in her concern for parish affairs. The thing is, Samuel Sauce, and here the Reverend employed the Christian name with that particular emphasis, which signals a shift to more confidential communication. There are sometimes circumstances in a community's history which are not easily explained to those who are not present at the time. Decisions are made in good faith, with the best intentions, and yet circumstances conspire to make those decisions appear, in retrospect, less clear-cut than they seemed at the time. I imagine such situations must be quite distressing for those involved, Mr. Trewin observed, his tone conveying sympathy without judgment. Indeed. And the passage of time, rather than clarifying matters, sometimes only serves to obscure them further. Memory is an imperfect instrument, you know. What seems certain to one person may appear quite different to another. Mr. Trewin offered no response to this observation, allowing the silence to extend until the Reverend felt compelled to fill it. "I suppose what I am saying is that some matters are best approached with humility and understanding, with a recognition that good people may sometimes find themselves in situations where no course of action is entirely satisfactory. "That is certainly true," Mr. Trewin agreed. "Though I have also observed that good people, when confronted with such situations, often find relief in addressing them directly rather than allowing them to fester in uncertainty." The Reverend's expression suggested that this observation, while not unwelcome, was perhaps more challenging than he had anticipated. He departed soon after, leaving Mr. Trewin to his work and his reflections. 2 visits in a single day, both circling around the same unspoken concern. Mrs. Finchley worrying about what might exist in documentary form. The Reverend seeking to establish a framework of understanding and forgiveness for decisions made long ago. Neither had asked him directly about the promise mentioned on Christmas Eve, yet both had made it abundantly clear that the subject weighed upon their minds. Mr. Trewin returned to his ledgers, but his thoughts continued to move through the landscape of questions that had been posed without being asked, concerns expressed without being named, and truths that hovered just beyond the edge of acknowledgement, waiting with patient persistence for the moment when they might at last step fully into the light. Outside, the January afternoon darkened toward evening, and in the registry office, Mr. Trewin worked on, his pen scratching steadily across the pages where Harthwell's official history was recorded, one careful entry at a time. Chapter 5. The Ease of Acceptable Explanations. There exists in every community a collection of narratives which might be termed the official story, though no document records them and no authority has formally approved their content. These are the explanations which have achieved, through repetition and mutual consent, the status of accepted truth. They are the answers given when questions arise, the interpretations offered when uncomfortable facts require contextualization, the comfortable certainties which allow a town to proceed through its days without the burden of excessive introspection. Harthwell possessed its share of such narratives, and in the weeks following the disturbance of Christmas Eve, these stories began to circulate with renewed vigour, as though the town had collectively determined that the best response to inquiry was a robust reaffirmation of what everyone already knew to be true. Mr. Trewin first encountered this phenomenon during a visit to the butcher's shop, where he had gone to purchase a modest chop for his supper. Mr. Grimshaw, the butcher, was a man of considerable girth and commensurately large opinions, who conducted his commercial transactions with a running commentary on matters of local interest. On this particular afternoon his discourse turned, with that appearance of spontaneity which often masks careful preparation, to the subject of Harthwell's charitable character. "We are a generous town, Mr. Trewin," he declared, his cleaver descending upon a joint with emphatic precision. "Always have been, always will be. Why, there's not a family in need that hasn't benefited from our Christian charity. Mrs. Finchley sees to that, and the parish fund and the various subscriptions, a more open-handed community you'd struggle to find in all of England." "Indeed, Harthwell has much to be proud of in that regard," Mr. Trewin agreed, accepting his rapt purchase. "Mind you," Mr. Grimshaw continued, as though addressing an objection that had not been raised, "one must be practical about these things, can't go promising the moon to every hard-luck case that presents itself. A town has to consider what's sustainable, what's reasonable. No good making commitments one can't keep, is there?" "I suppose that would depend," Mr. Trewin observed mildly, "on whether the commitment was made rashly or with due consideration, and on whether it has truly become impossible to fulfil or merely inconvenient." Mr. Grimshaw paused in his work, his cleaver suspended in mid-air. "Well, circumstances change, don't they? What seems possible one year might prove quite impractical the next. Anyone with sense understands that." This same theme, with minor variations, presented itself repeatedly over the following days. At the draper's shop, Mrs. Morton spoke warmly of how the town had always balanced charity with prudence. At the bakery, young Mr. Wickham, who had inherited both his father's business and his father's opinions, mentioned how previous generations had sometimes been overly ambitious in their philanthropic planning, Even the postmistress, usually confined to observations about the weather and the regularity of the mail, found occasion to remark upon the wisdom of not overextending oneself in charitable commitments. What struck Mr. Trewin about these various pronouncements was not their content, which was individually unremarkable, but their collective consistency. It was as though some unspoken agreement had been reached regarding the proper interpretation of events, and each speaker was dutifully reciting their assigned portion of a larger script. The most elaborate of these explanations came from Mr. Harold Bryce, the proprietor of the ironmongery, and a man whose commercial success had coincided. Mr. Trewin could not help but notice, with the period during which the forgotten promise had been allowed to lapse into obscurity. Mr. Bryce, encountering Mr. Trewin on the high street, engaged him in conversation with that hearty bonhomie which successful merchants often employ when addressing those of lesser financial standing. "I understand there's been some talk about old parish business," Mr. Bryce said, his tone suggesting that such talk was both misguided and faintly unseemly. People who weren't here at the time stirring up matters they don't properly understand. "I have heard some mention of it," Mr. Trewin replied, with characteristic neutrality. "The thing you must understand, Trewin, is that business was all sorted out years ago. There was a family, you see, fell on hard times. The town discussed what might be done. Collections were taken, various forms of assistance were considered, but the family, they decided to relocate, went to Manchester, or perhaps it was Leeds. Better opportunities, you understand, quite voluntary, the whole thing." "I see. So the funds that had been collected, well, they were redirected to other worthy causes, all proper and above board. Nothing mysterious about it, nothing untoward, simply a matter of adapting to changed circumstances." "And the family prospered, I hope, in Manchester or Leeds?" Mr. Bryce's expression flickered briefly with something that might have been discomfort. "I couldn't say for certain, lost touch as one does, but I'm sure they managed perfectly well. Industrious people find opportunities wherever they go." What Mr. Bryce did not mention, though Mr. Trewin had learned it through more circuitous channels, was that the family's departure had occurred during an unusually harsh winter, and that their relocation had been rather less voluntary than the official narrative suggested. Nor did he mention that the funds collected had been absorbed into various general accounts, their specific purpose gradually forgotten in the press of other, more immediate concerns. Miss Clara Mayhew provided another perspective when Mr. Trewin encountered her at the lending library where she served as volunteer librarian on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Miss Mayhew was a spinster of uncertain years and definite opinions, possessed of that particular form of honesty which manifests as inability to sustain comfortable fictions, even when doing so would serve her own interests. "You've been hearing about the Ashford family, I expect," she said without preamble, her hands occupied with the stamping of returned volumes. "That's who it was, though no one likes to use the name these days. Makes it all too specific, you see. Easier to keep things vague." "I confess I had not heard the name," Mr. Trewin admitted. "No, well, you wouldn't have, before your time in Harthwell, or near enough. I was younger then, full of enthusiasm for charitable works, sat on the relief committee, took minutes at the meetings. We made such fine speeches, Mr. Trewin, such noble declarations about Christian duty and community responsibility." She paused, her expression distant with recollection. And then the actual doing of it proved more complicated than the talking about it. There were concerns about setting precedents, about the expense, about whether the family was truly deserving. One meeting led to another, and another after that. We formed a subcommittee to study the matter properly, and while we were studying and deliberating and ensuring we approached the situation with due diligence, winter deepened, and the Ashford situation became increasingly desperate. What happened to them? They left. In the middle of February, on a morning so cold the water in the horse trough had frozen solid, packed what little they had and took the coach to the city. We told ourselves they'd gone seeking better prospects, that they'd make a fresh start. Perhaps they did. I hope they did. She returned her attention to her books, her movements sharp with something that might have been remembered shame or present anger, or perhaps both. The thing is, Mr. Trewin, we weren't cruel people, we weren't heartless. We simply wanted to be certain we were doing the right thing in the right way. We wanted everything to be proper and sustainable and well considered, and while we were being so very careful and thoughtful, the people we meant to help slipped away into the cold, and we were left with our good intentions and our unexpended funds and our comfortable certainty that we had acted with appropriate prudence. Mr. Trewin thanked her for her candour and took his leave. He walked slowly back to his lodgings through streets that were beginning to fill with the smoky dusk of a January evening. All around him, Harthwell continued in its accustomed rhythms, its citizens going about their business with that comfortable assurance which comes from inhabiting a world whose stories have been settled and agreed upon. But Mr. Trewin now possessed what he had not possessed before, a name, the Ashford family, not a vague abstraction, not an anonymous hard-luck case, but actual people who had lived in this town, who had been promised help, and who had departed into uncertainty while that help remained locked in the careful deliberations of committees and the cautious prudence of good people who feared making mistakes more than they feared failing to act. The official explanations had been offered, complete and consistent. The comfortable narrative had been reinforced by repetition until it achieved the solidity of established fact. And yet, underneath all those careful justifications, underneath all that reassuring talk of changed circumstances and voluntary relocations, there remained the simple, uncomfortable truth that a promise had been made, and then, through various forms of well-intentioned delay, allowed to dissolve into the mist of collective forgetting. Mr. Trewin climbed the stairs to his modest rooms and lit his lamp against the gathering darkness. Outside, Harthwell settled into evening, secure in its explanations, comfortable in its certainties, and largely at peace with its history. But peace built upon convenient forgetting, Mr. Trewin reflected as he prepared his simple supper, possesses a curious fragility. It endures only so long as the questions remain unasked, and the forgotten remain safely buried in the past. Once memory begins to stir, once names are spoken and stories are recalled, that comfortable peace discovers itself to be rather less stable than it had supposed. The Ashford family. He repeated the name silently to himself, according it the dignity of acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, they would no longer be merely an abstraction in Harthwell's carefully maintained narrative. They had been restored to the status of actual human beings who had suffered actual hardship while good people deliberated about the proper form their assistance should take. It was, Mr. Trewin thought, a beginning. Chapter 6. What each person thought they owed. The registry office held within its walls and upon its shelves a peculiar sort of treasure, though not of the kind that would excite the interest of common thieves. The ledgers and documents that lined its cabinets represented something far more valuable than gold or silver. They were the accumulated memory of Harthwell itself, recorded in ink that had faded from black to brown, but remained, for all that, perfectly legible to those who possessed both the patience to read and the interest to understand. Mr. Trewin had always taken quiet satisfaction in the orderliness of these records. Each volume had its proper place, each entry its assigned position in the chronological march of human events. Birth records occupied the upper shelves on the eastern wall, marriage registrations the middle shelves on the western side, and death certificates resided, with what seemed like appropriate gravity, in the lower cabinets nearest the floor. But there were other documents as well, records of property transfers, notices of charitable trusts, memoranda of civic decisions that had seemed significant enough at the time to warrant official preservation. It was to these miscellaneous archives that Mr. Trewin now turned his attention, not with any sense of illicit investigation, but rather with that same methodical curiosity which he brought to all aspects of his work. If the Ashford family had been the subject of official consideration, if committees had met and funds had been collected, surely some trace of these activities would exist in documented form. He began his search on a grey Saturday afternoon, when the office was closed to the public and he could work undisturbed. The relevant period, as Miss Mayhew's recollections had suggested, would have been some 15 years previous, during a winter remembered for its exceptional severity. Mr. Trowin pulled the volumes for that year and began his careful examination. The births and deaths told their usual stories. Infants arriving with stubborn persistence despite the cold, elderly residents departing with equal inevitability. But it was in the supplementary records that Mr. Trowin found what he sought. A memorandum dated December of the relevant year, written in the precise hand of Mr. Blackwood's predecessor as town solicitor, outlined the establishment of a relief fund for a family fallen upon the temporary hardship through no fault of their own. The document specified neither the family's name nor the exact nature of their difficulties, maintaining that careful vagueness which allows official papers to seem both significant and non-committal. However, it did note that subscriptions had been collected to the amount of £43 and 7 shillings, a substantial sum for a town of Harthwell's size, and that these funds were to be held in trust pending the committee's determination of the most appropriate form of assistance. Further searching revealed a series of committee minutes, recorded with admirable thoroughness by someone whose handwriting Mr. Trowin recognised as that of a younger Miss Mayhew. These minutes documented meeting after meeting, each one addressing the question of how best to assist the unnamed family, each one concluding with the decision that further study was required before any action could be responsibly taken. The progression made for melancholy reading. In December, the committee had met with evident enthusiasm, their language full of determination and Christian purpose. By January, the tone had shifted to one of careful consideration, with much discussion of precedent and sustainability. February's minutes were briefer, their language more defensive, and the final entry, dated the 23rd of that month, noted simply that the family in question having removed themselves from Harthwell, the committee's charge must be considered concluded. There was no mention of what had become of the £43 and 7 shillings. For this information, Mr. Trowin was obliged to consult the parish accounts, which revealed that the collected funds had been transferred, some 3 months after the Ashfords' departure, to the General Charitable Fund, there to be distributed at the discretion of Mrs. Finchley's Relief Committee. The notation was brief and businesslike, carrying no hint of the broken promise it represented. No acknowledgement that money collected for a specific purpose had been quietly repurposed once that purpose had become, through inaction, impossible to fulfill. Mr. Trowin sat back in his chair, the document spread before him on his desk. He felt no triumph at these discoveries, no satisfaction in having unearthed what others had preferred to leave buried. Instead, he experienced a profound sadness at the gap between intention and action, between the genuine goodwill that had motivated the initial response and the gradual erosion of that goodwill under the pressure of caution and delay. For it was evident from the records that no single person bore sole responsibility for what had occurred. The committee members had not refused to help, they had merely wished to ensure that their help was appropriate and sustainable. The subscribers had not been miserly. They had contributed generously to what they believed to be a worthy cause. Even the decision to redirect the unused funds had been made with ostensible logic. If the intended recipients were no longer present, surely the money could do good elsewhere. And yet, the cumulative effect of all these individually defensible decisions had been the abandonment of a family in desperate circumstances. Good people acting with ostensible prudence had failed to act at all until action had become moot. Mr. Trowin's own connection to these events now demanded his attention, though it was a connection he had long avoided examining too closely. His family had arrived in Harthwell this spring, following the Ashfords' departure. His father, a cock of modest skills and uncertain health, had sought the position at the registry's office, which had been vacated by the previous assistant's retirement. Young Samuel, then barely 20, had accompanied his parents to this new town, knowing only that they were seeking a fresh start after difficulties in their previous home. He had not known then, and had not learned until years later, that his father's appointment had been facilitated by Mr. Bryce, who had connections to the office's administrators. Nor had he understood that Mr. Bryce's assistance had been motivated not by pure generosity, but by a desire to demonstrate through conspicuous charity to a struggling family, that Harthwell took care of those in need. The unspoken message had been clear. See how we help the deserving poor, how we provide opportunities for honest labour, how we embody Christian charity. The irony had not escaped Mr. Trowan when he eventually learned the full story. His family had benefited from the very charitable impulse that had failed the Ashfords, had been living proof that Harthwell cared for those in hardship, even as that care had come too late for those who had needed it most urgently. This realisation had shaped much of Mr. Trowan's subsequent life. He had remained in Harthwell, eventually inheriting his father's position, but he had done so with a keen awareness of the debt he carried. Not a financial debt, certainly, but a moral one. His presence in the town was, in some sense, built upon another family's absence. His modest security rested upon the foundation of their displacement. He had therefore made it his quiet practice to notice those whom others overlooked, to remember what others preferred to forget, to maintain in meticulous detail the records that preserved Harthwell's complete history, not merely the comfortable portions of it. If he could not undo what had been done, he could at least ensure that it was not entirely lost to memory. Now, with the documents spread before him and the truth laid bare in careful notations and fading ink, Mr. Trowan faced a question he had long anticipated but never quite confronted. What did he owe? What did any of them owe? Not in the strict legal sense, for the law would likely find little fault in decisions made in good faith, however badly they had turned out, but in the moral sense, in that deeper accounting which transpires in the privacy of conscience. What debt remained outstanding? Finchley, whose charitable work had been built upon funds originally intended for the Ashfords, surely owed something. The Reverend, who had counselled patience and prudence while the family suffered, carried his own burden. Mr. Reasand and Mr. Bryce, whose business interests had flourished during the same period when assistance was being perpetually delayed, bore a responsibility that no amount of subsequent generosity could entirely erase. Miss Mayhew, who had recorded each meeting with faithful precision while doing nothing to challenge the endless deferrals, had her own reckoning to make. And Mr. Trowan himself, who had prospered modestly in a position that might have been offered to a member of the Ashford family had they remained, who had lived for years in comfortable awareness of this history without taking action to address it, what did he owe? The documents provided no answer to these questions. They recorded only facts, dates, amounts, decision taken and not taken. The moral arithmetic would have to be calculated by other means, in the accounting books of conscience rather than in the ledgers of official record. Mr. Trowan carefully returned the documents to their proper places, ensuring that each volume was precisely aligned, each paper correctly filed. The records would remain where they had always been, available to any who wished to consult them, though few ever did. The truth had not been hidden exactly, it had merely been overlooked, its significance diminished by the passage of time and the accumulation of more immediate concerns. But now it had been seen, acknowledged, understood. The question was no longer what had happened, but what, if anything, could or should be done about it now, so many years later, when the injured parties were long gone, and the responsible parties had grown comfortable in the belief that the past was settled and complete. Mr. Trowan extinguished the lamp and prepared to close the office for the evening. Outside, the January dusk was gathering, and Harthwell's streets were quiet save for the occasional passer-by hurrying home to supper and warmth. It was a peaceful scene, orderly and familiar, but Mr. Trowan knew now what he had long suspected, that peace built upon unacknowledged debts was fragile indeed, and that sooner or later the accounting must be made complete. Chapter 7. A winter the town learned to forget memory, that curious faculty by which we preserve the past for consultation in the present, operates according to principles that are not always conducive to accuracy or fairness. It tends to polish pleasant recollections until they gleam with an almost unnatural brightness, while allowing uncomfortable truths to accumulate the dust of benign neglect. In this manner, A town might remember with perfect clarity the decorations that adorned its streets during a particular Christmas, while forgetting entirely the family that shivered in inadequate lodgings during that same festive season. The winter in question had been, by all accounts, exceptionally severe. Mr. Trewin discovered this not through official records, which maintained a discreet silence on meteorological matters, but through the patient examination of old newspapers preserved in the library's archives. Miss Mayhew, when applied to for access to these materials, had provided them without question, though her expression suggested she knew precisely what he sought, and why. The newspapers painted a picture that the official documents had carefully avoided. Beginning in late November and continuing through February, there had been repeated accounts of hardship occasioned by the extraordinary cold. The river hearth had frozen solid, disrupting the operation of the mill and throwing numerous workers into temporary unemployment. Coal prices had risen sharply, placing warmth beyond the reach of many households. There had been cases of frostbite, instances of illness exacerbated by inadequate heating, and at least 2 deaths directly attributed to the cold. It was in the midst of this general distress that the particular suffering of the Ashford family had unfolded. Mr. Trewin found their name mentioned in several editions, though never prominently, and always with that delicate vagueness which newspapers employ when discussing matters that might prove uncomfortable to their more substantial subscribers. Thomas Ashford had been a wheelwright, a man of skill and steady employment until an injury to his hand had rendered him incapable of his accustomed labour. The newspaper mentioned this injury only in passing, but reading between the carefully neutral lines, Mr. Trewin inferred that it had been serious and permanent. A wheelwright who cannot grip his tools with sufficient strength is a wheelwright no longer, and Thomas Ashford had found himself abruptly transformed from a respectable tradesman to an object of charity. His wife, Mary Ashford, had taken in sewing to supplement their dwindling resources, but the cold had made even this difficult work nearly impossible. One cannot sew with fingers numbed by frost, and coal for heating must be purchased before it can warm a room. There had been 3 children, their ages ranging from 4 to 11, and the newspaper's brief mention of their circumstances had employed that particular tone of sympathetic concern which newspapers use when they wish to appear compassionate without actually advocating for uncomfortable action. The committee's formation had been announced with considerable fanfare. The newspaper had devoted nearly a full column to the town's generous response, listing the names of prominent subscribers and praising Harthwell's noble tradition of caring for its own. Reading this account 15 years after its publication, Mr. Trewin could almost hear the self-congratulatory tone in which it must have been composed. But as the weeks passed, the newspaper's coverage had shifted in revealing ways. The initial enthusiasm gave way to shorter notices about committee meetings and deliberations. Then came a period of silence, during which the Ashford name disappeared from the pages entirely, though other news continued to be reported with customary regularity. It was not until late February that the family was mentioned again, and then only in a brief notice stating that they had departed Harthwell for opportunities elsewhere. What the newspaper did not report, but what Mr. Trewin could reconstruct from the documentary evidence and the recollections of those willing to speak frankly, was the reality of those intervening weeks. The Ashfords had waited through December as the committee deliberated about the most appropriate form of assistance. They had waited through January as subcommittees were formed to study various proposals. They had waited into February as the cold deepened and their situation grew increasingly desperate, sustained by promises that help was forthcoming and assurances that the committee was working diligently on their behalf. Miss Mayhew, when Mr. Trewin gently raised the subject during one of his library visits, had provided details that no newspaper would have printed and no official record would have preserved. "The children stopped attending school," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the volume jour was cataloguing, not because their parents were neglectful, but because they had no adequate clothing for such weather. Mrs. Ashford sold nearly everything they owned of any value, trying to keep food on the table and some semblance of warmth in their rooms. And all the while, we on the committee were having earnest discussions about sustainability and precedent. She paused, her hands stilling in their work. I remember the last meeting I attended before they left. It was the 18th of February, bitterly cold even by that winter's standards. We met in the church vestry where there was a good fire burning. We drank hot tea and discussed whether direct financial assistance might create dependency or whether it would be better to arrange some form of employment, though what employment could be found for a man with a crippled hand, no one could quite specify. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and at its conclusion we had decided to form yet another subcommittee to examine the question more thoroughly. And the Ashfords, Mr. Trewin had prompted gently, left 5 days later. I learned of it only afterward. They had scraped together just enough for coach fare to Manchester, where Mrs. Ashford had a distant cousin who might possibly be able to help them. Or might not. They had no certainty of anything except that remaining in Harthwell meant continuing to wait for help that never quite materialised. The picture that emerged from these various sources was one of cumulative failure rather than deliberate cruelty. No single person had refused the Ashfords' assistance. No committee member had argued against helping them. Instead, there had been an accumulation of reasonable-sounding concerns, each one valid in isolation, but collectively forming an impenetrable barrier between need and response. There had been worries about creating precedent, about the sustainability of assistance, about the moral hazard of providing aid without proper conditions and oversight. There had been questions about the exact nature of Thomas Ashford's injury and whether it was truly permanent. There had been suggestion that perhaps the family's difficulties were not entirely attributable to circumstances beyond their control, that perhaps better management of their resources might have prevented their situation from becoming so dire. Each concern, considered individually, had seemed responsible and prudent. Each question had appeared to merit careful consideration before action was taken. And so the committee had met and deliberated and formed subcommittees and requested additional information and scheduled further meetings, all with the genuine intention of eventually providing appropriate assistance. Meanwhile, the Ashfords had grown hungrier, colder and more desperate with each passing day. Mr. Victorian as Trewin, reading through these accounts and reconstructing this history, found himself reflecting on the peculiar nature of collective failure. It was so much easier to see the faults in individual action than in the workings of committees and processes. A single person who refused to help a neighbour in distress was clearly culpable, but a committee that deliberated too long, that studied too carefully, that demanded too much certainty before acting, such a committee appeared merely to be exercising appropriate caution. And yet the result was the same. A family in need had been failed, not through malice or indifference, but through an excess of prudence that had valued process over outcome, caution over compassion, and the comfort of careful deliberation over the urgency of actual suffering. Young Samuel Trewin had witnessed the Ashfords' departure, though he had not understood its significance at the time. He had been walking past the coaching inn on that February morning, and he had seen a small family boarding the Manchester coach with their meagre possessions. He remembered a woman with a thin, careworn face, a man who held his left hand awkwardly against his body, and 3 children whose clothing was manifestly inadequate for the weather. He had thought nothing of it then. People came and went from Harthwell with regular frequency. Only later, when he had learned who they were and why they were leaving, had that brief glimpse acquired its full significance. By then, of course, it was far too late to do anything except remember, and even that remembering had been something the town preferred to discourage. For Harthwell had learned in the months and years that followed to forget that winter. The exceptional cold was remembered certainly, and the hardships it had occasioned were occasionally mentioned. But the Ashford family and the promise that had been made and broken gradually faded from collective memory, preserved only in documents that few consulted and in the private recollections of those who had been involved. It was, Mr. Trewin reflected, a masterful piece of collective amnesia, achieved not through any deliberate conspiracy, but through the simple human preference for remembering what was comfortable and forgetting what was not. The town had moved on, as towns do, to other concerns and other seasons. Life had continued with its customary rhythms, and if somewhere in Manchester or Leeds, or wherever they had finally settled, the Ashford family remembered Harthwell with bitterness, well, that was unfortunate, but hardly something that needed to disturb the town's present tranquillity. Except that it did disturb that tranquillity, Mr. Trewin thought, closing the last of the old newspapers. It disturbed it in ways both subtle and significant, in the defensive explanations that circulated when questions were raised, in the careful avoidance of certain topics, in the persistent unease that underlay Harthwell's comfortable certainties. A promise broken does not simply disappear because it has been forgotten. It waits, patient and persistent for the moment when memory returns and the accounting so long deferred must finally be made. Chapter 8. The Cost of Keeping the Peace. There exists a curious paradox in the life of small communities, whereby the very qualities that make them pleasant places to inhabit, those being familiarity, continuity, and mutual regard, can also serve to perpetuate injustices that a less harmonious society might more readily confront and correct. In a town where everyone knows everyone else, where reputations are carefully cultivated over decades, where social standing depends upon maintaining good relations with one's neighbours, the preservation of peace often takes precedence over the pursuit of truth. Harthwell had been, for as long as anyone could remember, a town that prided itself on its harmony. Disputes were rare, and when they occurred were settled quietly through the mediation of respected individuals, rather than through the public acrimony of legal proceedings. Church pews were inherited through generations. Business partnerships endured beyond the lives of their founders, and families intermarried with sufficient frequency that half the town could claim some degree of kinship with the other half. This tight weaving of social connections had many advantages, chief among them being a general atmosphere of mutual support and collective identity. But it also meant that challenging one person's conduct inevitably implicated others, that questioning one decision required examining the roles of numerous parties, and that disturbing the settled accounts of the past threatened to unsettle the comfortable relations of the present. It was this dynamic that Mr. Trewin now understood with painful clarity as he observed the subtle alterations in Harthwell's social landscape following his quiet investigations. The town had not failed to notice his interest in old records, his conversations with Miss Mayhew, his careful perusal of archived newspapers, and while no one confronted him directly, the collective response was unmistakable in its implications. Mrs. Finchley, whose charitable works had long been the pride of the parish, found herself the subject of whispered conversations that ceased with suspicious abruptness whenever she approached. Her smile, always so carefully maintained, had acquired a brittle quality, as though she suspected that behind every polite greeting lurked an unspoken accusation. She redoubled her charitable efforts with almost frantic determination, organising additional relief efforts and increasing her personal subscriptions to various funds, as though the sheer volume of present generosity might somehow balance the ledger of past failures. The Reverend Calder's sermons, always inclined toward themes of forgiveness and understanding, now returned to these topics with such insistent frequency that even his most devoted parishioners began to notice. He spoke eloquently of the dangers of judging others, of the importance of Christian charity in viewing the mistakes of good people, of the necessity of moving forward rather than dwelling in the past. His words were undoubtedly sincere, emerging as they did from genuine conviction, yet they carried an undertone of defensiveness that transformed spiritual guidance into personal plea. Mr. Bryce, whose commercial success had been built in part upon the favourable reputation he had cultivated through conspicuous generosity, grew noticeably irritable when charitable matters were discussed in his presence. He continued his customary donations to various causes, but where previously he had done so with evident pleasure in the recognition such gifts brought, he now contributed with a kind of grim determination, as though fulfilling an obligation rather than exercising benevolence. And Miss Mayhew, whose honesty had opened the door to these revelations, found herself gently excluded from certain social circles. The exclusion was never explicit, never formalized, but it was real nonetheless. Invitations that would once have been extended were quietly withheld. conversations that she might have been included in proceeded without her participation. The message was clear. Those who disturbed comfortable silences, however truthfully, paid a social price for their candour. Mr. Trowin himself became the subject of speculation that ranged from sympathetic to suspicious. Some viewed his investigations as evidence of admirable dedication to truth and justice. Others saw in them a disturbing tendency to dredge up matters best left undisturbed. A few, with the particular insight that comes from having something to hide, recognised that his interest in the Ashford case might stem from personal connection rather than abstract principle, though they could not quite determine the nature of that connection. What none of them fully grasped was the moral calculation that Mr. Trowin had been conducting in the quiet of his own conscience. For years he had lived with the knowledge that his family's modest prosperity had been built, however, indirectly, upon the foundation of another family's failure. He had accepted this reality with a kind of passive resignation, telling himself that he bore no personal responsibility for decisions made before his arrival, that he could not be held accountable for benefits he had not sought. But this comfortable position had become increasingly untenable as he uncovered the full scope of what had occurred. It was one thing to accept a position that happened to be available through unfortunate circumstances. It was quite another to benefit from a system that had deliberately failed those in greatest need, while rewarding those whose needs were less urgent, but whose social connections were more advantageous. The registry office itself had become a kind of monument to this dynamic. Its careful records documented births and deaths, marriages and property transfers, the official transactions by which Harthwell maintained its social order. But what it did not record, except in those fragmentary documents that required deliberate searching to uncover, were the gaps and silences where justice should have operated but did not. The Ashford family appeared in these records only as absences, a committee formed but ineffective, funds collected but redirected, assistance promised but never delivered. Mr. Purusha Golfite Trewin found himself contemplating with increasing urgency what form of restitution might be possible at this late date. The Ashfords had departed 15 years earlier. They might be anywhere, or nowhere. Thomas Ashford might have recovered sufficient function in his hand to resume his trade, or he might have spent the intervening years in poverty and struggle. The children would be grown now, their lives shaped in ways both large and small by that winter, when their hometown had deliberated while they suffered. To locate them would require effort and resources. To offer restitution would require convincing a town that preferred to forget that remembering served any useful purpose. And to succeed in either endeavour would necessarily disturb the careful equilibrium that Harthwell had established, wherein past mistakes were acknowledged in the abstract while being carefully insulated from present consequences. Yet the alternative, Mr. Trewin reflected, was to join in the collective amnesia, to allow the broken promise to remain broken, to prioritise present comfort over past justice. And this he found himself increasingly unable to do. Not from any sense of moral superiority, for he recognised his own complicity in the system he now questioned, but from a simple, stubborn conviction that some debts, however old and however inconvenient, demanded payment. The cost of pursuing this path was becoming increasingly apparent. Already he sensed a cooling in certain relationships, a wariness in interactions that had previously been cordial. Mrs. Pemberton, whose initial question had set this entire chain of events in motion, now avoided his eye when they passed on the street. The clerk at the draper's shop, usually voluble and friendly, had grown tacitly reserved. Even Miss Mayhew, whose honesty he admired, and whose conscience he recognised as equally troubled, maintained a careful distance, as though association with him might prove socially hazardous. Harthwell was demonstrating, with subtle but unmistakable clarity, the price it exacted from those who disturbed its peace. The town did not expel such individuals, did not formally censure them, did not engage in any overt hostility. Instead, it simply made them aware, through 1,000 small gestures of exclusion and reserve, that they had violated an unspoken compact, that they had chosen principle over harmony, and that such choices carried consequences. Mr. Trewin understood all of this, felt the weight of it in his daily interactions, recognised the social isolation that awaited him should he continue down this path. A more prudent man might have retreated at this juncture, might have allowed the matter to settle back into comfortable obscurity, might have chosen the preservation of his own social standing over the pursuit of justice for people he had never known and might never find. But Mr. Trewin had spent 15 years in quiet observation of Harthwell's workings, had maintained its records with scrupulous care, had noticed what others overlooked and remembered what others forgot. He had been, in effect, the town's conscience, even when the town had no desire for such service. To abandon that role now, to choose comfort over duty, would be to betray not only the Ashfords, but also his own carefully maintained integrity. The evening light faded beyond his window as he sat at his desk. The day's work completed, the ledgers properly filed, everything in its ordained place. Outside, Harthwell settled into its customary evening rhythms, its citizens retiring to their homes, its streets emptying into that peaceful quiet which the town had always prized. But Mr. Trewin knew, as perhaps the town itself was beginning to suspect, that this peace was fragile, maintained only through the collective agreement not to examine it too closely, and that once such examination began, once questions were asked and answers demanded, the comfortable certainties upon which that peace rested might prove less stable than anyone had wished to believe. The cost of keeping the peace, he reflected, was sometimes paid by those who most needed justice, and the cost of pursuing justice might be paid by those who dared to disturb comfortable silences. The question now was not whether costs would be incurred, but who would bear them, and whether that burden would be distributed fairly or allowed to fall, as it had before, upon those least able to shoulder it. Mr. Trewin rose from his desk and prepared to extinguish the lamp. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new choices, new opportunities to act or to retreat. But tonight, in the quiet of the registry office, surrounded by the documented history of Harthwell's triumphs and failures, he knew with certainty what path conscience demanded he follow, regardless of the price. Chapter 9. A Promise. Recalled at last. There are moments in life when the ordinary flow of time seems to pause, when decisions that have been approaching through gradual stages suddenly present themselves with unavoidable clarity, demanding resolution. For Mr. Trewin, such a moment arrived on a grey February morning that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to that other February, 15 years previous, when the Ashford family had departed Harthwell on the Manchester coach. He had risen that morning with a sense of purpose that had been building through the previous weeks of the investigation and reflection. The time for quiet observation had passed. The facts had been gathered, the history reconstructed, the moral accounting completed to the extent that solitary contemplation could achieve. What remained was the more difficult task of bringing these private understandings into the light of public acknowledgement. Mr. Trewin spent the early hours of that morning composing 2 letters, each drafted with the same meticulous care he brought to all his written work. The first was addressed to Mrs. Finchley, the second to Reverend Calder. In each, he expressed with respectful directness a request for a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern relating to the parish's charitable obligations. He did not specify the Ashford name, nor did he need to. The letter's recipients would understand perfectly well what subjects he wished to address. The responses arrived with a swiftness that suggested his correspondents had been anticipating such a communication. Mrs. Finchley proposed that same afternoon at her residence. The Reverend suggested the following morning in the church vestry. Mr. Trewin accepted both invitations and prepared himself for conversations that would, he suspected, prove more significant than their modest settings might suggest. Mrs. Finchley received him in her drawing-room, a space that reflected her character in its careful balance of comfort and propriety. The furniture was substantial without being ostentatious, the decorations tasteful without being severe. She offered tea with her customary grace, though Mr. Trewin observed that her hands trembled slightly as she poured. "I have been expecting this conversation," she said, once the preliminary courtesies had been observed. "Indeed, I am somewhat relieved that it is finally to take place. Uncertainty is often more burdensome than difficult certainty." "I am grateful for your willingness to speak frankly," Mr. Trewin replied. "I know these matters are not comfortable to revisit." Mrs. Finchley set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I have thought of little else these past weeks, Mr. Trewin. Since that unfortunate moment on Christmas Eve when the past was mentioned so unexpectedly, I have found myself unable to maintain the comfortable distance I had established from those events." She paused, her gaze directed toward the window where February rain streaked the glass in patterns that seemed to mirror the complexity of her thoughts. "I was younger then, you understand, newly appointed to the charitable committee, eager to prove myself worthy of the responsibility. When the Ashford situation arose, I genuinely believed that careful deliberation was the path of wisdom. I argued for thorough assessment, for sustainable solutions, for ensuring that our assistance would truly benefit rather than merely provide temporary relief." "Those are not unreasonable concerns," Mr. Trewin observed gently. "No, they are not. And yet in retrospect, I see that they served another purpose beyond prudence. They allowed us to delay, to defer, to maintain the comfortable illusion that we were helping while actually doing nothing at all. Each meeting that concluded with a decision to meet again, each subcommittee that was formed, each additional question that was raised, all of these allowed us to feel virtuous without requiring us to act." She met his eyes directly now, and in her expression, Mr. Trewin saw something he had not expected. Not defensiveness, but a kind of weary honesty. "The funds we collected were substantial, £43.07, as I am certain you have discovered. That money could have provided the Ashfords with immediate relief, could have seen them through the winter, could have given Thomas Ashford time to recover what function he might in his injured hand, or to train for some alternative occupation. Instead, we held those funds in endless deliberation until the family departed in desperation, and then we quietly absorbed the money into our general charitable accounts." "Have those funds been well used in the years since?" Mr. Trewin asked. "They have been used. Whether well or not, I leave to others to judge. I have distributed assistance to numerous families, have organised relief efforts, have managed the parish charitable work with what I believe to be appropriate diligence. But I cannot escape the knowledge that my current position, the respect I enjoy, the influence I wield in charitable matters, all of these rest upon a foundation that includes our failure toward the Ashfords." The rain continued its steady percussion against the window. In the silence that followed Mrs. Finchley's admission, Mr. Trewin could hear the clock on the mantelpiece marking time with its patient regularity. "What do you believe we owe them now?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Finchley's response came without hesitation, as though she had been contemplating this very question for weeks. "We owe them acknowledgement. We owe them the truth that we failed in our promise, not through malice, but through cowardice disguised as prudence. And if they can be found, we owe them restitution, both of the funds originally collected and of whatever additional amount might serve to compensate for the hardship our inaction caused." She rose and crossed to a small escritoire from which she withdrew a folded document. "I have been making inquiries, Mr. Trewin, discreet inquiries through connections in Manchester and Leeds. I believe I may have located the Ashford family, or at least I have located individuals who may be able to direct us to them." Mr. Trewin accepted the paper she offered, noting the addresses and names recorded in her precise handwriting. "You've been conducting your own investigation. I could hardly do otherwise once the matter had been raised. My conscience, long suppressed beneath layers of comfortable justification, proved less amenable to continued silence than I had supposed." The conversation with Reverend Calder the following morning proceeded along remarkably similar lines. He too had been anticipating this discussion, had been conducting his own painful self-examination, had arrived at conclusions that required acknowledgement and action rather than continued evasion. I told myself I was preserving harmony, he said, his hands clasped before him in an attitude of prayer or perhaps of penitence. I convinced myself that patience and careful consideration were virtues, that rushing to judgment or action would be spiritually irresponsible. But the truth, which I can no longer avoid, is that I counselled delay because delay was easier than decision, that I chose the comfort of the congregation over the needs of the suffering, that I failed in the most fundamental duty of pastoral care. He produced from his coat pocket a small notebook, its pages covered in neat script. I have been calculating what the original sum would amount to now, had it been properly invested on the Ashfords' behalf. With compound interest over 15 years, £43 would have grown to nearly 70. I propose that the parish pay this amount at minimum should the family be located. More, if the vestry agrees, to account for the suffering our inaction caused. The two conversations, though conducted separately, had revealed a remarkable convergence of understanding. The principals in that long-ago failure had each, in their private reckonings, arrived at the same essential conclusion, that the promise must be honoured belatedly but genuinely, and that the cost of doing so, whatever it might prove to be, was a debt that honour and conscience demanded be paid. Mr. Trowan departed from these meetings with a sense not of triumph but of quiet satisfaction. He had not needed to argue, to accuse, to compel. He had simply provided the occasion for truths to be spoken that had long awaited expression. Mrs. Finchley and the Reverend had done the rest themselves, their own consciences proving more effective advocates than any external prosecutor could have been. That evening Mr. Trowan sat in his modest rooms and composed a third letter. This one to the address Mrs. Finchley had provided in Manchester. It was a careful letter, explaining without accusation, inquiring without demanding, offering the possibility of restitution while acknowledging that no amount of money could truly compensate for the hardship that had been endured. He did not know whether this letter would reach its intended recipients, whether the Ashfords would wish to respond, whether any form of meaningful restitution was still possible after so many years. But he knew that the attempt must be made, that the promise, so long broken, must at least be acknowledged and, if possible, finally kept. Outside his window the February rain continued, washing the streets of Harthwell with that thorough persistence which winter rains possess, and in his quiet room Mr. Trowan sealed the letter and set it aside for posting in the morning, one small gesture toward the correction of an old wrong, one modest effort to balance accounts that had remained unsettled far too long. The mystery of the broken promise had been solved not through dramatic revelation, but through patient inquiry and honest acknowledgement. What remained now was to discover whether the solution could lead to genuine resolution, whether promises broken could, even belatedly, be made whole. Chapter 10. When Christmas found its balance. Spring arrived in Harthwell with that particular quality of renewal, which seems all the more precious for having been earned through the patient endurance of winter. The crocuses appeared in their appointed places, the river Harth resumed its cheerful progress after months of sullen torpor, and the townspeople emerged from their homes with that sense of relief which comes when the darkness of the year begins its slow retreat before the advancing light. It was on a mild April morning that the reply arrived to Mr. Trowan's letter. He recognised the handwriting as belonging to neither Thomas nor Mary Ashford, but rather to someone writing on their behalf, and his heart quickened with the fear that perhaps one or both had not survived the intervening years. But as he read, his apprehension gave way to a more complex mixture of emotions. The letter was from Ellen Ashford, the eldest of the 3 children who had departed Harthwell on that bitter February day 15 years previous. She wrote with a directness that reminded Mr. Trowan of Miss Mayhew's unvarnished honesty, a quality he had come to value above more polished forms of expression. Her father, she explained, had died 7 years earlier, the injury to his hand having never properly healed and complications having eventually claimed his life. Her mother lived still in modest circumstances in Manchester, where she had eventually found employment in the household of a sympathetic widow. The younger children had fared reasonably well, one having apprenticed to a printer and the other having married a clerk whose steady if unspectacular employment provided adequate support. Ellen herself had become a teacher, a profession she had entered with the determination that the hardships of her childhood should serve some constructive purpose. She taught in a charity school, working with children whose circumstances often mirrored those she herself had known, and she took what satisfaction she could in helping them navigate difficulties she understood from painful experience. As for Harthwell's offer of restitution, Ellen's response was measured and thoughtful. The money would be welcome, certainly, particularly for her mother, whose years of labour had earned her a security more precarious than any person should have to endure in their later life. But more valuable than the financial restitution, Ellen wrote, was the acknowledgement itself, the recognition that their suffering had not been imagined or exaggerated, that the promises made had been real, and that their breaking had caused genuine harm. She concluded with a request that surprised Mr. Trewin in its generosity. Rather than directing all the restitution to her family, she suggested that a portion be used to establish a fund that might assist other families in circumstances similar to those her own had faced, families caught in that terrible gap between the recognition of need and the provision of assistance. Let something good come from what had been painful, she wrote, and let Harthwell's failure become the foundation for future successes. Mr. Trewin carried this letter to his meetings with Mrs. Finchley and Reverend Calder, and together they read it in the same church vestry where, years before, committees had deliberated while the Ashfords suffered. The irony of the location was not lost on any of them, but they chose to interpret it as appropriate rather than painful, a sign that past failures could be the site of present redemption. The vestry meeting that followed was unlike any Harthwell had witnessed in living memory. Mrs. Finchley presented the facts with admirable clarity, omitting nothing of her own role in the original failure. Reverend Calder spoke with unusual force about the moral obligation to make restitution, his words carrying a weight that his more comfortable sermons had often lacked, and Mr. Trewin, called upon to verify the historical. Cord did so with his customary precision, allowing the documents to speak their own truth without embellishment or apology. There was resistance, of course. Mr. Bryce argued that reopening old matters served no constructive purpose, that resources would be better directed toward present needs than past failures. Others questioned whether the parish could afford such generosity, whether establishing a precedent of belated restitution might invite countless other claims from those who felt themselves inadequately assisted in years past. But Miss Mayhew, speaking publicly for perhaps the first time in any vestry meeting, offered words that shifted the tenor of the discussion. She reminded those present that the question was not whether they could afford to make restitution, but whether they could afford not to. The cost of maintaining a comfortable silence about past wrongs, she suggested, had been paid in the gradual erosion of Harthwell's moral foundation, in the defensive, justifications that had replaced honest accounting, in the fear of examination that had settled over the town's charitable works like a pall. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. £70 would be paid to the Ashford family, representing the original sum with appropriate interest. An additional £30 would establish the Ashford Memorial Fund, to be administered with the clear understanding that assistance would be provided promptly to families in genuine need, without the endless deliberations that had characterized previous efforts. The payment was made quietly, without public ceremony or self-congratulatory announcements. Mrs. Finchley herself travelled to Manchester to deliver the funds personally, a journey she insisted upon making despite her advancing years and the inconvenience of travel. She returned with the report that Mary Ashford had wept upon receiving both the money and the acknowledgement, though, whether from grief for what had been lost or relief at what was now restored, or perhaps from both emotions intermingled, Mrs. Finchley could not say with certainty. The establishment of the Memorial Fund proceeded with greater publicity, not from any desire for praise, but from the practical recognition that families in need must know of its existence if they were to benefit from it. A simple notice was placed in the newspaper, and the fund's purposes and procedures were explained with a transparency that contrasted sharply with the opacity of previous charitable arrangements. As spring progressed towards summer, Harthwell discovered something curious. The town had not been destroyed by its acknowledgement of past failure. Its reputation had not been ruined by the public admission that good people had made serious mistakes. Instead, there emerged a quality that had been largely absent from its charitable works for many years: a sense of genuine purpose, unencumbered by defensive justifications or the fear of examination. The Ashford Memorial Fund assisted 3 families in its first 6 months of operation, providing help with a swiftness that would have seemed reckless by the standards of the old committee, but which proved both effective and sustainable. In each case, the assistance was given without the endless deliberations that had characterized earlier efforts, guided by the simple principle that genuine need deserved prompt response. Mr. Trewin returned to his customary routines at the registry office, his days once again occupied with the steady work of recording Harthwell's vital events. But something had shifted in his relationship with the town. The wariness that had developed during his investigation had dissipated, replaced by a respect that seemed to him more valuable for having been earned rather than assumed. People greeted him with a warmth that acknowledged what he had done, not in disturbing their comfort, but in calling them to their better selves. Mrs. Finchley continued her charitable work with renewed vigour, but with a changed approach. She delegated more freely, trusted more readily, and worried less about maintaining perfect control over every detail. The result was not chaos, as she had feared, but a more robust and responsive system of assistance, one that involved more people, and therefore distributed both the work and the moral responsibility more evenly. Reverend Calder's sermons acquired a new quality that his congregation noticed, even if they could not quite articulate what had changed. He spoke with less defensiveness and more conviction, less concern for avoiding discomfort and more willingness to challenge his flock to higher standards of conduct. His church did not empty in response to this shift. Rather, attendance increased slightly, as though people had been waiting for someone to ask more of them than mere comfortable compliance. And when Christmas came round again, as it does with reliable regularity regardless of human affairs, Harthwell celebrated with its customary traditions and familiar rituals. The decorations appeared in their appointed places, the carols were sung with accustomed harmony, and the season proceeded with that comfortable predictability which the town had always valued. But there was something new as well. At the Christmas Eve gathering in the parish hall, now an event to which no one came with hidden anxieties or defensive explanations, Reverend Calder made brief mention of the Ashford Memorial Fund and the assistance it had provided during its first year. He spoke without self-congratulation, simply noting that promises long broken had been, if not entirely repaired, at least honestly acknowledged and partially redeemed. And Mr. Trewin, standing once again by the window with a cup of tea in his hand, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The hall was warm, the company convivial, and the consciences of those present appeared notably lighter than they had been 12 months earlier. It was not a perfect resolution, for the Ashford's suffering could not be undone, and Thomas Ashford could not be restored to life. But it was an honest one, built upon acknowledgement rather than evasion, sustained by action rather than comfortable intentions. As the evening drew to a close and the guests departed into the clear winter night, Mr. Trewin performed his customary service of straightening chairs and extinguishing candles. But this year, when he snuffed the final flame and stood in the darkened hall, he felt none of the ambiguity that had troubled him previously. The door that had been left ajar on that earlier Christmas Eve had been properly closed, not through force or denial, but through the patient work of conscience and the willing acceptance of responsibility. Outside, the December stars shone with that particular clarity which comes on cold, cloudless nights. Harthwell slept in peace beneath them, a peace that rested now upon firmer foundations than comfortable forgetting. Promises kept, even belatedly, possess a strength that promises avoided can never achieve. And Christmas, when properly observed, asks not merely whether we have meant well, but whether we have acted when action mattered. and whether, when we have failed, we have possessed the courage to acknowledge that failure and make what amends we can. Mr. Trewin walked home through streets he had traversed countless times before, but which seemed to him now subtly altered, as though the town itself had shifted in some fundamental way. Harthwell remained what it had always been, a place of tradition and continuity, but it had added to these qualities something it had lacked: the willingness to examine its own history honestly, and to accept responsibility for its failures as readily as it claimed credit for its successes. And in this balance, this willingness to remember fully rather than selectively, to acknowledge debts as well as assets, Harthwell had found, if not perfection, at least a more secure foundation for the future. For a town, like a person, can be judged not only by its triumphs but by how it addresses its failures, not only by the promises it keeps but by how it responds when promises are broken. The Christmas promise had been kept at last, and in its keeping Harthwell had discovered that justice, even delayed, strengthens rather than weakens the bonds of community. The story had reached its conclusion, not with drama or upheaval, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes when conscience guides action, and when the long work of moral reckoning achieves, at last, its proper resolution.